you can hear and acknowledge what they're saying without agreeing with them.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life. This week, we had Joy Rosenthal on the show, and we had a great conversation about why mediation is empowering for women, what issues you should and should not mediate on, and some shocking mediation stories from our guest. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Joy Rosenthal is joining us. Joy is the founder of Rosenthal Law and Mediation in New York City, New York. Today, Joy and I will be discussing why mediation can be empowering, how mediation offers reduced emotional and psychological strain, and my favorite, why mediation is the ultimate tool for women specifically. Welcome to the show, Joy.
Hi, Heather. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, well, so am I. So, Joy, for our listeners, please share a little bit about your journey to now being the founder of Rosenthal Law and Mediation and how you got there.
I started out as a women's studies major in college, and then I did a bunch of different things, but went to law school to work with kids. I was volunteering, doing some literacy work with teenagers, and found that they all had legal issues, which surprised me. So I went to law school late. I had taken a lot of time off in between, but really to work with children and families. And then when I got out of law school, I spent about 10 years representing children in family court. These were kids in foster care whose parents were accused of abuse or neglect, or who had been arrested. When I was working with the kids who'd been arrested, a lot of them were getting arrested for fights. These really should be mediated. There wasn't a clear perpetrator and victim. It was more of a dispute between equals that wasn't being handled well. So I got really interested in mediation. I realized that I could use my background in family law and my interest in mediation together to do divorce mediation. That would also help the kids. I went out on my own in 2006, almost 18 years ago, and started doing mediation and collaborative law then. And I also do adoptions, particularly adoptions for same-sex couples. So I was doing some litigation in the beginning, but now I really only do mediation.
Got it. Well, that is a great story. You have so much experience that I know helps you with your current practice. Now, let's just jump right into our title today. Why is mediation good for women?
So I think the first thing I'll say is it can be an empowering experience. The thing that's difficult and wonderful about mediation is that clients can make their own decisions. It puts more pressure on the clients to say what they want and to express themselves, but that's also in itself a very empowering experience. And especially if you've been in a relationship where you don't feel like you have a voice, to get to a place where you find your voice and you express it and you're supported in saying it, that's really terrific. And what I do as a mediator is I'm there to hear each person, right? So if you have a mediation between a woman and a man, I'm there to help the man hear what the woman, I'm hearing what the woman's saying and reflecting it back to her and saying, did I get this right? He's listening to it in a different way, and then vice versa. Right. But it might be a way for her to be heard in a situation where she might have really felt like she wasn't being heard before.
I agree. I think mediation is required in Florida, all divorces. It's required. And so we are very familiar with it. Every case goes to mediation. That is a divorce or even a post-divorce.
issue. What I have found in my experience and for our clients, particularly with really very good mediators, because they are able to help clients feel they've been heard, which is very important. So many clients can't wait till the judge hears this. They really just want to tell their story. In a courtroom, it's not going to feel as great as you think. In a mediation setting, you can really be heard. There's time. You can tell the mediator exactly what you want as far as your side and why you feel that way, which in a courtroom, you don't have time for that, nor is all of that relevant always. So
That's exactly right. I think that's a really good point. People want to be able to express their stories and be recognized for what they've been through.
Mm.
One of the biggest differences between a judge and a mediator is, at least in New York, the mediator is not making decisions. The mediator can hear you, can help you express what's important to you, and can empathize with what you've been through. But you and your spouse are the ones making the decisions. Part of the
and
job is to guide you through that decision-making process.
absolutely facilitating that and bringing each side closer to that result. Now, for our listeners, is mediation required in divorce situations in New York?
No, there's what we have what's called presumptive ADR, which means presumptive alternative dispute resolution, which means that every civil case in New York, including divorces that's filed, is presumed to be appropriate for mediation unless proven otherwise. So if there's domestic violence, for instance, it would not be referred to mediation. There are other cases. My practice tends not to be working with people who have already filed in court. I work with clients for people, it's a self-selective process where people think about what their different options are, they hear about mediation, and then they approach me. I also have a free video course helping people know about what the different options are so they can decide which is the best option for them. I'll make sure your listeners know about that.
Absolutely. We'll make sure we have that in our show notes. Do you think the women who choose to embrace mediation get a better outcome than those who are set on litigating?
Yes, for a lot of reasons. First, when people mediate, because they've been the ones making the decisions, they're more invested in the outcome and there's much better compliance. They don't have to go back to court a million times afterward, and they're usually people will do what they say they're going to do. Two, the question I ask is, whose kids do you want to put through college, yours or your lawyers? Divorce is incredibly expensive. No offense, incredibly expensive. Mediation is one of the few processes that's cheaper and better. If you can save that money for your kids' medical costs, your kids' education funds, or whatever, 529 accounts, or your retirement, wouldn't that be better than paying a lawyer to fight for you? The third thing, and perhaps the most important, is that mediation is a problem-solving approach, and you're not focused on blame. You're not focused on what happened in the past. You're really focused on how are things going to work moving forward, and so it gives a model to the spouses of how to move forward and how to solve problems together. That's invaluable, rather than relying on people, giving power to other people to solve problems like your lawyers, rather than staying engaged in the fight. It's really kind of calms things down rather than riles things up. And I think that's
well, and especially when you share children, because the relationship is always, there's always a connection. And if you can come to terms together, through mediation, it's going to make that easier down the road because of, it's hard not to have lasting animosity if you have litigated, to the fullest extent, sometimes for years, appeals, it just can go on and on and on. Some people get so ingrained in litigation that it's just fueling something within them. You can't have closure and move on with your life if you're in constant litigation. I know that's a minority of people and an extreme. However, it's going to weigh on you. It takes so much emotional energy from you that you could be putting towards your children, yourself, your future.
One of the things I really learned from working with kids is kids really want everybody to get along. They don't care so much about whether one's right or the other one. They really want peace, and they want to be free to love both of their parents or whoever their caretakers are. They really want peace more than anything.
That's a really good point that I think is important to make. And we don't always, talk about that. Hey, what would be better for your kids? I mean, we do in the sense of time sharing, but not what they want out of this divorce. Now, divorce can be incredibly stressful. How would you say mediation can help reduce emotional strain? And why is that especially important for women who are going through a difficult separation?
I think that women are often, this is a bit of a stereotype, but women are often much more emotionally in tune with themselves and with their kids. I think women tend to really worry about what their kids' experience of the divorce is and be in tune with how the kids are doing in school and with their friends and what the toll of the divorce is on their kids. I think that mediation, as you just said, is because it's less stressful, means that everybody gets along better. It's also, as we discussed, makes more money available to the family rather than to the lawyers or courts. I think that women are already generally juggling so much, right? They're juggling being a mom, often being a daughter, being a wife, having a job, being a good friend, just really don't have time, don't have space for themselves. It's mediation, it's not for everybody, but when it works, it's really a way of taking care of yourself and integrating the decisions that have to get made in a divorce into the rest of your life.
How would you advise clients to prepare for mediation emotionally? Go to therapy.
Deal with the emotions and the grief you have about the end of your marriage. Get a really good support system. A therapist can be really helpful in dealing with your emotions. Deal with the emotions outside of the mediation session, outside of talking to your lawyer.
Yeah.
Deal with the emotion. Your lawyer is not your therapist. And we lawyers are not great at being therapists, and it costs a lot more than therapists do. So if you can, find a support system, not somebody who's going to say, yes, 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 get everything we want from him. I mean, everything you deserve, every little bit. That's not the objective. The objective is, I want as peaceful a process as possible. I want to get through this as painlessly as possible. And I want to get this as quickly as possible, right? So the way to prepare for it emotionally is to deal with those emotions, because you're going to want revenge. You're going to be angry. You're going to be really hurt. You're going to be really sad. The vision that you had for your life is now going to be a different vision, right? And you have to be able to prepare yourself for what the next steps are going to be. You have to be able to take the leap of faith to know that you're going to have a great and wonderful life. It's just not going to look like what you expected. You're going to have the confidence that you can still be a great parent and your kids can have a great childhood, even though they're living in two different homes or their parents are living in two different homes. Like that's a lot of psychological work. And the place to do that work is outside of the negotiation room.
Yes. One of the things that we do in mediation, as I've been practicing for many years and as a firm, is really help our clients understand, okay, let's chalk through your best day in court, right? Because nobody's going to settle. He's not going to settle for that. Let's try to identify that and then work backwards and understand what your worst day is. We're not going to ask you to settle there, and begin to really think about where you're willing to compromise. We try to prepare our clients before mediation to get into that way of thinking. If they're not quite in that way of thinking, how do you help the parties narrow down what's important to them and what is going to be negotiated?
So that's a really good question. The whole basis of this is to help the parties understand what they're saying and why they're saying it. Let's say they're arguing about, I want to have the kids, one parent wants to have the kids only on Saturdays and split up the weekend. So one parent has the kids on Saturdays and the other one on Sundays. The other parent wants whole weekends. If you drill down and ask, why is it important for each party to have one day over the weekend? The answer might be, I need the other weekend to sleep. I'm so exhausted. I need a whole day every weekend in order to rest or prepare for the week. Or I go to church all day on Sunday. I know that's boring for my 5-year-old and I don't want to put her in daycare for the whole day. The other parent might want to have whole weekends because they want to go away. They have a house 2 hours away and it's not practical to go there one day and come back the next.
Yeah.
If you understand why things are important, then you can come up with different options so that you can get a full day of rest every week and you, other spouse, can still have the weekends where you go to your weekend house. So you're coming up in, and maybe it doesn't look like what either of them were thinking about.
Right.
But it also gets them problem solving together. Right? So the problem isn't with each other. The problem is instead you're positioning the whole thing where the two spouses are saying, that's interesting. Maybe we can solve this. And they're working together, not apart. Now all of a sudden they're working together to try to solve a problem that's outside of them. And it doesn't always work, but the positioning is really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, which that's why mediation sometimes, I don't know, how long is your average mediation? Do you usually have a day, sometimes 2 days? Do people come back? Just because I'm curious for our listeners to hear what you think about that.
I'm so glad you asked that question. I don't do it that way. We meet for 90 minutes. And maybe we'll meet for 90 minutes once a week. Maybe it's every other week. We have time in between. I ask them to go back and look at their budgets, to write budgets, or I give them homework. I ask them to contact this person or that person who's a resource. They come back after they've done that. I find that it's so emotionally exhausting that we need those little chunks of time over time. And the other thing that is good about that is it gives them time if they want to, let's say they're coming up with a parenting plan, they can try out a parenting plan and then come back and say, oh, this isn't working, or it needs to be tweaked in this way or that way, something else will happen. It takes longer in a way, but it's much less stressful.
That makes a lot of sense. And I've never heard of it done that way, but I understand why for sure. I think most people, when they're thinking, okay, we're going through a divorce, they want it to be a smooth process. Now, why do you think, if you agree, that women particularly are looking for it to be a smooth process?
I was going to say, because we're nicer people.
Maybe that's just it.
We don't have that need to dominate. I think it has to do with women looking out for the kids a lot. Not that men don't, men do also. I think that women have so much stress in their lives that they want to reduce the stress and maybe aren't so invested in being angry or in the fight.
It's a generalization, but sometimes they're not as invested in being right as just being done as well. They just want it to go smoothly and be done. At least in my experience, I hear from the women, like, this is affecting my kids. They recognize it. That's very high up on the list. In my experience, they want it to be smooth and as amicable as possible. They really have concerns for the effect on the children.
Right. And what you just brought up about being right versus being done is really important, because in mediation, you have to proceed by agreement, right? You have to, the other party has to agree on everything. If somebody comes into my office saying, I have to get $300,000 and the other person doesn't have $300,000, you're like, and they're like, that's what I deserve. When I'm like, well, it might be what you deserve, but it ain't there. So the other person's never going to agree to it. Let's come up with something more realistic.
Yeah.
That you can both agree on.
Mm-hmm.
So it does involve letting go in some ways.
Yeah.
Letting go of the outcome the way you expected it sometimes.
Letting go of what you expected, what you believe, what you heard, your best friend, they ended up with, and, everybody wants that, even though the finances aren't the same, or the situation can be so different. It's just not the same. Everybody comes in with their own idea of, well, this is the way it should be. In Florida, as of a year ago, we had a change in the statute. Some of the biggest changes in family law in Florida in many years. And one of them changed the presumption of the time sharing for the children. It used to just always be the best interest of the children, and you'd have varying customs depending on where in Florida you were, but it wasn't 50-50. It wasn't presumed that it was going to be equal. It was getting more like that, I think, as a reflection of most families. But now it's a presumption in the law. Many women, even before the change in law, would struggle with that because their identity is so wrapped up in being a mom. That shift within the divorce, who am I if I don't have my kids half the time? Some even over the weekend. It's just too much. How do you help women deal with that? I'm sure you've had some experiences, because it's going to change when you're living in separate households. You're not going to have your children all the time.
It's one of the hardest things, especially in the beginning. New York City is so expensive that a good chunk of the women I work with don't work, but a good chunk of them do.
Okay.
And so it's, for the women who work, having 50-50 parenting time is actually really helpful, because all of the parents that I work with tend to adjust their schedules so they work longer on the days when the other parent has the kids, and less, that way they can make themselves available to pick the kids up from school or daycare. For the parents who have been home with the kids and now have to look for jobs and still want to have those jobs be flexible, that can be very difficult. There's the emotional part, like you're saying, of how do I spend one night alone without my kid, right? And not be worried about them. And there's the other part, how am I going to be expected to support myself when I still need to be there for the kids? So that's another issue. But going back to the first issue, fathers, and certainly when there's two moms or two dads, that's already going to be more egalitarian. When it's a mother and a father, times have changed. Fathers expect themselves to do a lot more childcare than they used to.
I think that's what we see mostly. More and more families, both parents are working and handling those responsibilities. Even if they didn't handle a lot of them, then, you hear afterwards, they realize it was a lot more work than they thought. It's shocking. How do you think mediation gives women more control over the outcome of their divorce or custody disputes compared to going through the court system?
Another thing that helps women spend that first night alone with their kids is, once they realize they have a night alone without their kids and they have a little bit of a break, they really appreciate it.
And it's okay to appreciate.
They can be more present for their kids when they come back, because they've had a chance to rest and take care of themselves. And that's really important. The question you just asked was, how does it improve outcomes?
Well, giving them more control over the outcome in mediation versus going through the court system.
It gives them more control because they have more of a voice. They can speak directly to the other person, the spouse, whereas if they're in court or in litigation, they speak to the lawyer speaks to the other lawyer, or the lawyer speaks to the judge speaks to the other lawyer. So there's much more direct communication. That's one thing. Two is much more control over the timing, because courts in New York are so backed up. They're months before you can get a hearing. And three, you're much more involved in the decision making. You're not going to agree to something you don't agree to. So you have much more control over the outcome rather than somebody who doesn't know your family making decisions, having read some papers and a little bit of court time. What I always say is, you and your spouse are the experts on your situation. You know your kids' strengths and weaknesses, your strengths and weaknesses, what's realistic, what's not, what the family can do together or not do together. Nobody else knows that. Even your lawyers don't know it. They might know more, but the judge certainly doesn't know what's going on.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's true. Because it's like, say, a good example, a 20-year marriage, depending on the issues, to get a full day of trial, it goes so quickly. And the judge is going to make decisions on these 20-year marriage, all these issues in 8 hours. And they're going to make some pretty standard decisions based on the law. It is so much better to have input and control, knowing I chose this because for the overall, it's best. And I think it's easier to live with that a little bit.
Absolutely. And you have to think about the whole forest, not each tree.
That's one of the hardest things. We've had this a lot in mediations and time sharings. It's just that one more night. It may be that the husband's just like, no, I've got to have 16 nights a month or 15 or 14. It can't be. And they're so stuck on a number. At the end of the day, how much longer are the children going to be under this schedule, how old they are? Sometimes they aren't seeing the big picture, which is really about the relationship and not whether you have 13 nights in a month or 14.
That goes back to what I was saying before. Kids want everybody to get along. They're much less focused on the exact number of nights. And you also have to look at, is he saying that because he wants to get out of paying child support or because he really thinks it's better for the kids? As a mediator, what I would do in that situation is really try to drill down and get both parents to focus on what are the kids' needs. Remind them that this is not about each of them having their own rights as adults. It's really focused on what do the kids need. The kids need to have a good relationship with both parents. They need to have a close relationship with both parents. Is there another way of resolving this issue? What is really important? Is there a way of making sure that you can do FaceTime with your kid or help your kid with their homework even when they're with the other parent, or pick the kid up from school and take them to the other parent's house? Are there other things that you can build in? You can go to the football games or the basketball games or the soccer games. Are there other things you can do?
What would you say to women who may be listening and thinking, my ex and I will never agree, or my husband and I will never agree to anything. Mediation will not work for us?
I would ask why. Again, right? That's my question. Why I think that? If the reason is because he always made all the decisions, I don't have any voice in this, and he's not going to listen to anything I say, then I would really listen to that and maybe say, to understand if there's a real big power imbalance, and if she thinks he's only going to say it's my way or the highway, then maybe mediation isn't appropriate, and maybe she does need an advocate to fight for her. If the reason is not that, but just because we don't agree about anything, I would say the only thing you have to agree about is to go to mediation. And then let's try it. And maybe it'll work, but at least you can try.
And at what point, like, I mean, you indicated that, severe like power imbalance, what are some other situations that are not appropriate for mediation in a divorce, in addition to the power imbalance?
You have to be making informed decisions, right? So you have to be honest about your finances and trust that the other person's being honest about their finances. If you've always filed your taxes together and you have all joint bank accounts and you have access to all the bank accounts, no problem, right? You
Right.
know exactly what's going on. Even if your spouse is the one that's been paying the bills and you're not exactly sure how to write a check, you can learn that, but you have access to all the information. They're being honest and transparent. Then that's
Okay.
fine. If
Mhm.
they have a cash business and they say they're earning $35,000 a year, but they're taking trips on their yacht and taking all their friends out on their yacht, and you can't trust that, then I would be wary. You have to be able to
Mhm.
make informed decisions and trust that they're being honest, particularly about the finances. That's one thing. If one person is actively using drugs or alcohol and is coming to the negotiation sessions under the influence where they really can't make decisions, or they're
Mhm.
taking some kind of psychiatric medication and really are
Right.
not able to make decisions for themselves, that's not appropriate. And the third is domestic violence. With domestic violence,
Yeah.
it's automatically excluded if there's ever been any domestic violence. But I actually would ask the person who, the survivor of it, is it still going? I would ask more questions. Is it still going on?
Right.
Are you afraid of them? You think because if they are afraid and they can't make decisions, they can't speak up for themselves, then they
Right.
should be in mediation. But sometimes
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, 10 years ago, we had an incident. We've gotten over it. We've talked about it. We've worked it out on therapy. I'm fine. It's not going to, I know it's not going to happen again. Then I would say that mediation is probably still appropriate.
Now, you've mentioned before on another podcast that you had a mediation where the husband reached over the table and grabbed the woman by her collar. What did you do to calm everyone down?
Well, that was one of my first mediations. I didn't know what to do. We were in the family court, and a court officer came running in right away and stopped it. I now, well, a couple things. After that, I mediated in my office, and I always made sure that my assistant, who was a man, was around, and I didn't mediate when I was alone in the office with clients.
Mhm.
Now I mediate on Zoom, so it can't happen. I am much more experienced now, and I would not let things get so heated, and I
Uh-huh.
would be much more in tune with the body language and the emotional dynamic of what's going on. I would tell people, if you need to take a break, let's do that. I would just say, I need to take a break. Let's take a 5-minute recess, turn off our screens, go take a walk, breathe, and then come back. Sometimes it's good to allow the tension in the room, and sometimes it's better to try to understand what's really going on, and maybe we should resume this at another time. It's another
Mhm.
reason why I think it's better to have shorter mediation sessions to give
Right.
people more time to process what's happening in between.
Mhm. Yeah, I and like I said, we don't do it that way here. Oftentimes, we as the attorneys are only in the room we're in, but we can assume by the length of time that the mediator spends over there that some of the issues or positions are really, they haven't considered, they're kind of blown away. Sometimes we've even had to continue the mediation because the other party is just like, I was not ready to make a decision about this, or I didn't prepare myself emotionally for some of these things. The emotional side of it is definitely present. And having those shorter sessions makes a lot of sense. Let that sink in so you can begin to think about this is an issue, and seeing it from the other person's perspective as well, having some time to absorb that before you make a full decision that is going to be in writing and signed off on.
Yes. And you just referred to something that I think we should bring up.
Okay.
The mediations that you participate in, so you're the lawyer for one of the spouses, presumably the wife,
Right.
right? Is the mediator going from one room to the other and talking to you and the other side separately?
It used to be across the board, when I first started practicing, that the mediators always started everybody in the same room. And sometimes that went well, a lot of times it didn't. It created a lot of, because the lawyers were advocates, they're presenting their side. So most of the time, we are always in separate rooms. Sometimes they'll do a joint statement, but otherwise, most of our mediations are by Zoom now, and they go back and forth from one room to another.
The model that I use is very different. We don't have lawyers
Mhm.
in the room, almost always. Once in a while we do, but usually not.
Mhm.
I do everything with both clients together. The big advantage of it is that both clients know I'm not doing anything behind their back. The other big advantage is that I'm helping them hear each other better. The
Okay.
disadvantage is that there are things they might want to express to me that they can't. I do
Mhm.
have them fill out a questionnaire before we get started so that I can understand what the dynamics are. And I'm doing some screening to make sure that it's appropriate for mediation,
Mhm.
that form. That makes it more emotional, but I
Yeah.
think it helps them reach an understanding together better and understand where
Mhm.
the other person's coming from. One of the big things I have to teach clients is you can hear and acknowledge what they're saying without agreeing with them. So
Mhm.
they don't, that's hard because a lot of times
Yeah.
what's going on in a dynamic, they're there for a reason, right? They've been fighting. One person says something like, you always do this, and the other one immediately gets defensive. I do not. Then they're caught in this
Mhm.
dynamic of you do so, do to, whatever. Whereas if one person says, you always do this, which is not the best way to negotiate, but let's say they say that, then you could respond in a very different way by saying, huh, so it seems to you that I always do this, but that's not what I intend. This is what I meant to do, right?
Mhm.
And it's a very different conversation. You're
Yeah.
acknowledging that that's their experience, but you're not saying that you agree that that's the truth.
Right.
And you can really only do that kind of dynamic or change that or teach that when both people are together. So do you hear, even if you don't agree that you always do whatever it is, can you hear that that's what they're experiencing? Oh, yes, I hear that. They're wrong, but I hear it. Okay,
Right.
but we're getting somewhere.
Made some progress. All right. So I have to ask if you have a most memorable mediation that you'd like to share about.
I did a mediation. Actually, the wife wrote about it in the newspaper. Um, it was a husband and wife. They had a kid. They owned a house together. There were two apartments in the house. And the way they settled it was the husband kept the upstairs apartment, the wife kept the downstairs apartment. The kid went back and forth. So it was very fluid because whenever one
Mhm.
parent couldn't take the kid, the other one would. The kid was always at home, either upstairs or downstairs. They were really respectful. They came up with rules for what were they going to do when they had a new boyfriend or girlfriend. They we did the whole thing. It was really beautiful the way they worked it out. And then, as it turned out, the wife was a writer and she wrote a piece about this for the New York Times and
Yeah.
how awesome it was for all of them.
Oh,
That was really special.
that's wonderful. Well, this has been great. But Joy, before we go, can you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience?
Yeah, women are absolutely incredible and much stronger than they're given credit for, much stronger than they know. I think
Mhm.
that women's ability to reinvent themselves and to reinvent their lives and start over is absolutely amazing. And to make lemons out of lemonade,
Yeah.
I, I have seen over and over again, women can take a really difficult situation and make something beautiful out of it and be really loving to their kids and to themselves. And mostly the thing about being much stronger than they know and really starting over
Mhm.
again. Sometimes it is a leap of faith, but so often it pans out and they do really, really well after divorce.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And lastly, Joy, where can our listeners find more information and resources about you?
JoyRosenthal.com. So
All
it's
right.
JoyRosenthal.com. And
Well, we
also
have reached, oh,
I'm on social media. You can just look me up, look up my name and you'll find me.
and we will make sure to have those links in our show notes. We've reached the end of our show today. Thank you so much, Joy Rosenthal, for joining us to discuss all things mediation.
Thank you. This has been so much fun. I really have loved talking with you, Heather. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Joy. I've enjoyed it as well. Listeners, if you or someone you know is going through a divorce or thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at FloridaWomen'sLawGroup.com. You'll find our practice areas and the link to our website in the show notes. Thank you all for listening.